Despite having a long history with the Final Fantasy series, I wasn't sure I was going to play Final Fantasy XVI. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was limited time, knowing it'd be a big game. Maybe it was the $70 price tag and PlayStation exclusivity. Maybe I was a bit turned away by it being a character action game. I couldn't resist checking out the free demo when it appeared before release though, and it turned out they released a pretty great demo that convinced me I wanted to see the story through, if nothing else. Despite the emotional hooks being a little cheap and derivative, it was well executed. I didn't play the combat portion of the demo that showed off more skills to avoid any spoilers. I just finished the story the other day, and I thought it was finally time to talk about it a bit. I wish I'd made the time to talk about it more regularly as I was playing, because I had some pretty extreme shifts in thought about it at different times. But I think this will help me put the experience in perspective. This is an odd thing for me to feel like talking about first, but I wanted to talk about the game's performance. I was concerned about this from my demo experience, having tried both performance mode and graphics mode. Boy, was the substantially lower frame rate of graphics mode hard to reacclimate to coming from mostly PC gaming recently. But it did look notably better, and most important, it was stable. Performance mode felt substantially better in combat, but was jerky running around everywhere else to a point that bothered me. These traits carried over completely to the game's release, no changes. And worse, no option to disable the drastic motion blur present in graphics mode. Being a big AAA PlayStation 5 release, I was pretty surprised by this. The game looked good, but was it really taxing what I thought of as a fairly new and powerful console this hard? I guess the PlayStation 5 isn't that new anymore. This option between the graphics modes haunted me and killed my momentum, not feeling comfortable with either. I actually didn't play the game very much for the first couple of weeks after release. Then the developers released a patch that provided a few new options, including one for motion blur strength. I set this to 0, decided to stick with graphics mode, and didn't look back. The game looked pretty great, but I think graphics mode makes the combat harder. There are attack sequences I can't do consistently compared to performance mode, and I think the dodging feels sluggish. If I continue playing New Game Plus, I'll almost certainly do performance mode this time to see if I can get used to it, just like I got used to the lower frame rate of graphics mode, and still be able to enjoy that more responsive combat. As I was playing, I committed to doing basically every activity I could in the game, which I carried through until the end. Gameplay felt fairly limited, so I think I was just curious to explore any opportunity for variety. I finished every side quest, I did every hunt, I found, I think, just about all the extras. I wouldn't say I found a lot of variety, but it still says something that I did it all, finished the game, and ultimately felt like I had a worthwhile experience. Even if a part of that experience was deciding what I didn't like about it. I mentioned earlier that I had pretty drastic shifts in my reaction to the game at different points. At times there's no denying the game is absolutely insane, like in a good way, and unlike anything I've played before, the spectacle of it. Other times, especially when the pace slows and the narrative recedes for periods, I started to find the gameplay limited, the enemies frustrating, and the combat repetitive. I don't think there's a lot of unique details to share about my playthrough. Everyone who plays this game will have essentially the same experience, barring some flexibility in what combat abilities you're using and what side stuff you choose to do. Early on in the game, I thought the combat was pretty great. Familiar in many ways, but flashy, fun, different for Final Fantasy. Before long though, to avoid growing frustrations with enemy attacks and a somewhat limited arsenal of quote unquote normal moves, I realized my natural tendencies weren't playing into the best way, for me at least, to enjoy the combat. I stopped trying to juggle every enemy into oblivion, because many enemies you just can't juggle, and others die almost instantly. I stopped saving all my abilities for a big cash out when an enemy is staggered because staggering them without abilities felt too spongy. I stopped thinking I should be dodging every attack the first time playing an encounter because there is so much going on often that it's hard to even see things, and enemies frequently have some annoying attack timing variations. I spammed abilities, I embraced and enjoyed the chaos and spectacle. I turned things into a slugfest and healed my way through it. It was more fun that way. I also experimented a lot with every ability I got because, man, I think it'd get really boring after a while if you didn't.
Well, Sid. At least he's not throwing against one. Too slow.
Beyond combat, which is frequent and baked into pretty much every activity, I tried to go exploring in the more open areas of the game. I always liked navigating new areas and learning their layouts. I found locations here to be pretty, often beautiful, but not particularly large or fun to traverse, especially with all the smaller enemies scattered around constantly triggering combat music. There was also little to find. There were chests scattered around, mostly with crafting items and accessories that had little impact on anything. I had so many crafting materials by the end of the game, and absolutely nothing to do with them. At least, not until New Game Plus? Maybe? Question mark. There is equipment to make, but there are no real choices. Just make the next thing when the option appears. It's more powerful. There are a few items you get or unlock via side quests and hunts that get you some additional power. There's no real need for them, but they're a little something to strive for. Hunt targets were the most interesting things to stumble upon out in the world, and I wish I'd just ridden around searching for them instead of using the hunting board that shows their locations. Though the game, strangely, doesn't let you track these details. I ended up taking screenshots with the share button. Aside from some side quests that have real narrative impact on the world toward the later stages of the game, the hunts were probably my favorite side activity. None of the hunt targets were all that unique though, all following the somewhat limited set of enemy archetypes appearing elsewhere in the game. The narrative and its characters that hooked me in the demo is what carried me through the game, and why I consider it a primarily narrative experience. I don't think the game can keep up the pace and impact that it has in its earliest hours, and perhaps it would have been exhausting if it did. As I played, I found myself thinking of the game in 2 or 3 parts, or acts. Each one grows longer, and I think slows. I consider the first 2 pretty great, but the third is by far the longest. I appreciate the sense of realism and day-to-day life it brings, the fact that not every minute is some bombastic event, and it does serve to build your connections with many of the characters, primary and secondary. I appreciated these connections come the final events of the game. I still think parts carry on too long.
Not this time. You lose.
At the close, I found the ending satisfying, despite having a fantasy-breaking death at the final boss because I'd yet again forgotten to buy potions before setting out. You get a little taste of everything again during the final sequence, and my ability to enjoy the combat for what it is, by this point, was at its peak. With the help of the active lore system, which essentially just lets you review details of all events and things in the game, I think I actually followed all the story elements despite the long playtime. In a way, not much happened, but I felt something, and I realized how close I had become to many characters. Set aside a good chunk of time to wrap things up when you feel the end closing in, so you can play it uninterrupted. After wrapping things up, I still felt compelled to check out the New Game Plus mode. I was mostly curious to see what it was, but since the combat doesn't really feel deep enough to sustain the full length of the game, I was still surprised how interested I was to jump back in. I think it speaks to the feel of what is there in the combat, and the fun of playing around with your maximum damage or simply most fun ability rotations during staggers. Revisiting the beginning of the game, a day after finishing the story, and meeting a couple of the main characters again for the first time, it was a surprisingly nice feeling. I got a sense of what New Game Plus is pretty quickly though, and I don't think I'm keen to play through the whole story again right now, even if there is some new equipment and new enemies and familiar fights. It was fun to discover the differences, and if I do return to the game, this will be the way to do it. Trying out performance mode on the first couple of fights felt really good, despite that jerkiness out of combat. I've been reminding myself that the original Final Fantasy VII has been on my list for ages. After playing a ton of Final Fantasy IV and VI when I was a kid on Super Nintendo, I missed out on 7 and 8 because I didn't have a PlayStation until much, much later. I never had a chance to return to them. I think that it'd be fun, especially after playing 16, to return to that older style of Final Fantasy. And the Final Fantasy VII Remake games are in full swing at the moment. I've also been thinking about Final Fantasy XIII. Strangely, or not, maybe. I played a decent bit of 13 back when it came out, and like many people, it wasn't my favorite. Now I'm struck by how similar 16 seems in some ways to what I remember of 13. Times change, and I wonder what 13 would feel like today. The battle system of 13 was at least interesting, if different for Final Fantasy at the time. Ironically, I think I stopped playing right at chapter 10 when things finally started to open up a little bit. I also haven't played a Devil May Cry game in many, many years, but the combat in 16 is very reminiscent of it. How does Devil May Cry 5, which seems so highly regarded, compare? I have some expectations, but I'd be curious to try it and find out. So there's lots of potential things to tackle next. I've always got a huge list. And I'll probably look to something a little bit different for a change first. Thank you so much for your time tuning into the video. I love talking about games, so let me know in the comments your thoughts, your questions, what you thought about this game or whatever you might be playing. And until next time, take care.